Hello, everyone, and welcome to OST Live, a weekly broadcast on blockchain, branded tokens, and token economies. And we feature weekly guests from the industry to discuss the latest in blockchain and the projects that they are working on. And with us today, we have Matthew Liu. He is the co-founder of Origin Protocol, and they are building they have a product that's focused on building decentralized marketplaces, which is something that we're going to discuss today. Matthew, thank you for joining us on OST Live.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here and share what we're working on with the broader community.
So let's get started with your background before we get into Origin. You previously worked as a product manager at YouTube, which was acquired by Google, and you've also done product management at various other companies. Can you tell us about your background before Origin?
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm a product guy by training. So, as you mentioned, I was one of the early product managers at YouTube. Was the third PM there, roughly around employee 25 or so. And so, while I was there, worked on some consumer-facing features, but also some partner-facing features and advertising-facing features. Spent a few years at Google after we were acquired, and then was VP of product management at a couple other startups. Qwiki, which was eventually acquired by Yahoo, and Bonobos, which was eventually acquired by Walmart. And from there, the entrepreneurial itch, I wanted to scratch an entrepreneurial itch. This is probably around 2013 or so. And so I started working on my own businesses. Spent a few years building random products that didn't necessarily work, but then eventually found some product market fit. Actually across a couple different businesses. And so for a while I was running several different online businesses. These are more what in industry we would term, cash flow or lifestyle businesses versus full-on startups, totally bootstrapped, but generating revenue, profitable, doing 7 figures of revenue a year essentially. So from there, started getting more and more interested in decentralized technologies, including blockchain and cryptocurrencies. It was really an organic shift to get to Origin eventually. We first started just building our own portfolio management tools in crypto, built some automated trading bots, and did a little bit of algo trading. But as we started getting deeper and deeper in the space, understanding technology became much more of a priority to us. And as we dug deeper, we realized that despite the technology being very, very nascent and not necessarily scalable or reliable today, that if the blockchain and surrounding ecosystem were to actually scale, then over time it would be a very, very disruptive technology. And so that's kind of the origin of how we started working on Origin.
Great. So how long have you been working on Origin? How long has Origin been around?
Yeah, so my co-founder Josh and I have been working on it for about 1.5 years. The company was officially founded in October of last year after we had spent about 5 or 6 months prototyping, experimenting, determining how we wanted to tackle the market. And so since then, we've been at it about a year with funding and with the team and building pretty rapidly. And so we're pretty excited that in that year's time, we've been able to develop a pretty strong burgeoning community of people that are supporting us, including many developers that are interested in building on top of our platform. And also most notably and most recently, releasing a beta version of our platform to the Ethereum mainnet. That was basically the 1-year anniversary of the company founding in October, where we actually pushed out our smart contracts and announced that we were open for business.
Great, and some excellent progress there. Congrats for going on mainnet. So can you tell us a little bit about Origin Protocol? So it's a protocol for building decentralized marketplaces. Can you tell us a bit how it works and what it's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Origin is actually a platform for building decentralized marketplaces. And as part of that platform, we have a set of open source protocols that are built on the Ethereum blockchain as well as IPFS. That's kind of like our foundational layer. So how do we recreate marketplace functionality in this decentralized world? How do we think about identity, reputation reviews? How do we actually think about the transaction flow between a buyer and seller when they're doing this via smart contract without a trusted third party running this transaction? So that's kind of the base layer of the platform. On top of that, we also have, we're building a developer library in JavaScript to start, and we're calling that Origin.js. And the purpose of Origin.js is to abstract away some of the complexity of the blockchain and IPFS and make it easy for developers all over the world, even junior developers that have just learned JavaScript, to start playing around, right? We want to make it really, really easy for anyone to get started, lower that barrier of entry, lower that user friction. And then hopefully empower developers to use our library to launch marketplaces all over the world. And we're not necessarily expecting to take down Uber or Airbnb today, right? We're merely saying that these centralized marketplaces are examples of large monopolies that have created a ton of value for their customers, but have also captured a lot of that value in monopolistic terms. So we believe that we can enable true peer-to-peer commerce with all these developers building on top of our platform, potentially launching regional marketplaces, niche marketplaces, things that we would potentially not even expect, but then really allowing buyers and sellers to connect in a peer-to-peer way. And then there's one more component to our platform. So I talked about the smart contract layer at the bottom and the developer library in the middle. The top layer is our user-facing layer. So we've built a prototype decentralized application. It's the Origin dApp, and that is actually a front-end application in JavaScript that can be hosted really anywhere, right? So we're hosting it off of IPFS, and the idea is this application will make it easy for people to buy and sell on top of the Origin protocols. And given that we're in a cryptocurrency world and blockchain world, there's a lot of unique user experience challenges. Again, identity is a little bit different. We're talking about self-sovereign identity where you don't have a traditional email address and password. You have an Ethereum wallet and identity associated with that. There's the volatility of crypto prices. There's all these weird issues. And so we realized that we had to go all the way up to the top of the stack and try to smooth out some of those user experience issues. And so that's why we've built the dApp. And you can actually play around with it today at dApp.originprotocol.com. We would love if our listeners today checked it out, played around with the application, created a listing or bought someone else's listing. It all works right now. It's pretty basic, but it totally works. And then if you're a developer, go deeper, right? Check out our developer libraries and our open source code on our GitHub. Everything's open source. So would love for you to check it out at github.com/originprotocol.
Great. So at the developer level, this is meant for businesses that want to create their own marketplace. And at the dApp level, this is something where any user can buy or sell an item.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if we were to look forward a few months or a year or two from now, where we would like to be ideally is that the developer layer, Origin.js, is being used by many different applications. So a lot of front-end applications, distinct marketplaces. And many of those applications will hopefully borrow code from our dApp, right? So we're open sourcing everything. And I think a lot of our application code will be applicable to some of these third parties.
Got it. And does it also serve as sort of a case study where, it's the first marketplace? Is it the first marketplace on the protocol?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
So before we get into decentralized marketplaces, can you tell us a little bit about today's industry? So in today's marketplaces, we often hear the term sharing economy. Can you tell us a little bit about the current challenges in today's marketplaces?
Yeah, so internet marketplaces are not necessarily a new thing, right? The first ones were Craigslist or eBay in 1995. So they've been around for a couple decades now. And they're probably one of the best use cases on the internet, right? How do you actually create a digital meeting place for buyers and sellers to connect and eventually transact? And so throughout the past 2 decades, we've seen a lot of different marketplaces really rise and start becoming great businesses. And since about 2009 or so, that's when Airbnb, Uber, that's roughly around when those companies are founded. And they really pioneered the concept of the sharing economy. The sharing economy being, service providers providing some sort of service in a way where what they're providing is fractional in nature, right? So taking one home and splitting it up and renting it out on Airbnb, or having a driver take their car and then using that for transport for many, many different passengers. And so the sharing economy, as I think you and everyone else is aware, has really blossomed, right? So Airbnb is a $30 billion plus market cap company. Uber, I believe, is 70 billion at this point. And there are also many regional players. So Didi in China is the Chinese equivalent of Uber. There's also Grab in Southeast Asia. There's Airbnb clones in different parts of the world as well. And so as a whole, these sharing economy marketplaces, as well as more traditional marketplaces, have done a tremendous amount to change the world, right? They've created new economic value for sellers. They've created ease of use and new services for buyers. Great impact. And so in a way, we very much applaud all those entrepreneurs before us that built these great companies. However, we think that there are some flaws with the current model, and that this is also an area ripe for disruption. It's an area where sharing economy marketplaces are, they should evolve in the next decade, right? And so when you look at these marketplaces, there's a centralized intermediary. Let's use Airbnb or Uber as an example. And they help create trust in the system. They help create liquidity in the system. And so in Uber's case, because they create this trust and liquidity, they take 25% of the take rate from drivers. And that is, in our opinion, like ridiculously high when you're just creating the digital meeting ground for people. And drivers agree, right? They're not happy. A lot of drivers first loved Uber, and then Uber changed rules on them. The fees are too high. But these drivers now are beholden to Uber because they've taken leases out on cars, and it's kind of their way of life. But some drivers have described it as indentured servitude, or a bait and switch. And so, as great as these services are for the consumers, in some cases they're not great for the suppliers. And even if the supplier is pretty happy, there's room for improvement, right? If you can remove the middleman, you can remove those fees. So again, in the case of Uber, you can remove those 25% fees. In Airbnb, it's a bit less than that. If you're talking about wag.com, the dog sitting marketplace, it's like 40%, right? And so one of the things we're really focused on is if we can move to a truly peer-to-peer world rather than a peer-to-corporate monopoly, it's a peer world, then we can cut out the middleman, we can cut out those fees, and then that economic value can be shared between buyer and seller. And so we think that's a win for both sides. And beyond that, there are some additional other problems with the marketplaces that we see today. One of them is that marketplaces that are run by centralized companies, they can be a single point of failure, right? And so Uber is banned in certain cities. Airbnb is heavily regulated in San Francisco, banned in other cities, facing pretty staunch, somewhat oppressive regulation in other areas. And that's because it's really easy to target and attack them, right? But if it's decentralized, if it's distributed, then it's really hard for these censor policies to come into place, right? And then finally, we have a couple, there's two other things that motivate us to do what we do. One of which is another financial incentive, like how can you actually create more financial value for the buyers and sellers on the platform? And that's all around this new exciting world of crypto economics. And today, if you were an early driver on Uber, or you're an early host on Airbnb, you're looking at these crazy market valuations, and you're like, okay, cool, I didn't get really a piece of that, right? I got my revenue from working on the service, but the venture capitalists, the founders, early employees, they're going to make a lot more money than me. How come I don't have a stake of these platforms? And to a certain extent, Uber and Airbnb are looking at ways now to potentially reward their workers, like they've been lobbying with the SEC. But in our opinion, it's a little bit too late. They didn't think about this at the outset of building their platforms. Whereas when we're designing our peer-to-peer commerce platform, we're thinking already about how we can use crypto economic incentives to get the early stakeholders, what they're due, right? How do we actually reward them from participating in the network, adding value, adding liquidity, being trustworthy, being available for counterparties to transact with. And so I think that's going to be a very powerful movement. It's still very theoretical and hypothetical, but it's one of our main theses about how things are going to change in this new world. And then the last reason that we think that decentralized marketplaces are going to be really interesting is simply because as people in the Western world, we take for granted that these marketplaces are available everywhere. There's actually many markets where these traditional marketplaces are not available, and they're not available because it's not justifiable to open in these markets. They might be third world countries. The people living in these countries may not have stable banking systems or stable fiat currency. They can't even really pay for these services. It's just bad infrastructure. But we think that's going to change in the next 10 years or so. People are getting cheap Android phones, even if they're in sub-Saharan Africa or poor parts of Southeast Asia. This gives them the opportunity to get online. And cryptocurrencies, if cryptocurrencies continue to expand, give them an opportunity to exchange value without the permission of their governments, without permission of broken banking systems. And so that creates a new way for them to interact with other people in the digital economy. But they still need a place to actually meet, right? And so they need marketplaces to exist. These marketplaces don't exist today. But if we are successful at origin, we can hopefully be the genesis of all these new marketplaces, right? We can be the platform that these regional niche marketplaces emerge from, and that will hopefully create a lot of impact in the world, parts of the world that are currently overlooked or impoverished.
Great. So earlier you mentioned you're not going to disrupt Uber or Airbnb right away. And you mentioned the dApp that you guys are creating, which I'll pull up in just a second.
Sure.
But what comes to mind is earlier you mentioned Craigslist. Something else that comes to mind to me is something like OfferUp, which is sort of offline transactions. In person. So what platform would you say you would compare the dApp to? Because it's something unlike Craigslist. I'm just going to pull it up right now. So hopefully everybody can see this now. Because in here, the transactions are actually done on the dApp, right?
Correct. Yep.
So what platform would you sort of compare this dApp to?
Yeah, so keep in mind, this is the beta version of our dApp. And so right now, this version is probably closer to a pretty version of Craigslist or an OfferUp. It's like these single-use, for sale items, whether it's like a, you're scrolling right now, whether it's more like a service, like a pitch with a well-known venture capitalist, or a T-shirt or a used, home appliance equipment. We're actually seeing some pretty interesting, unique items being listed. The one on the left right now is by Blau, who's a well-known EDM DJ. And so he's well-known both in the EDM space, but also in the cryptocurrency space. And so he's putting up DJ lessons for 5 Ether. We're seeing a variety of these different types of listings, mostly because I think we're going after early adopters right now that have an interest in cryptocurrency. Over time, our dApp, as well as other dApps that we may release or third parties will release, will become more feature rich and will cover more verticals. So a lot of the work we're doing this quarter is supporting different types of listings. So we'll have more of an e-commerce use case by the end of the quarter, which means you can, it's more akin to like a Shopify or an Amazon marketplace. We'll also be releasing some of our work on fractional usage. And so this is like calendaring. This is booking time intervals, which, by the way, is surprisingly hard when you're trying to do this on blockchain, and there aren't, it's not easy to do date time and booking intervals on the blockchain. But that work should be done either end of this quarter or early next, which means that the get around use case, the Airbnb use case, they will be possible within Q1 of next year. That doesn't necessarily mean that Airbnb is going to go out of business, but it does mean that we could create a localized home sharing marketplace, somewhere in the world. For example, one of our partners, Trips, they plan to release a community-driven home sharing website in probably Q1 in Italy. So we we'll begin to see some of those use cases pop up across various rental markets. Again, home sharing, car sharing is some of them, but it could be office equipment or sporting equipment or used toys. And also the e-commerce use case. So I'm going to sell 50 t-shirts, or I'm going to sell something that's I'll sell electronics or something like that. Yeah.
Great. So if you guys want to check that out, I'll link it down in the description below. Something I did want to get to next was the advantages and disadvantages of a decentralized marketplace versus a centralized marketplace. And obviously, you mentioned earlier, the big disadvantage of a centralized marketplace is the fees that they charge. But something that I see in a centralized marketplace is that they have these barriers in place to protect against integrity. An example is with Amazon, they have an A to Z guarantee where if a seller scams a customer, Amazon will reimburse, and PayPal has sort of reversible transactions. So what's your take? Is this something you guys have thought about when building decentralized marketplaces?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the first things we thought about. One of the reasons that centralized marketplaces are able to get the business that they have is they're able to establish trust, right? And there's a certain amount of trust associated with that brand. And then the other advantage is once there's that trust, then they aggregate liquidity, right? There are network effects where the more buyers there are, the more sellers there are. The more sellers there are, the more buyers there are. And so I think that's what we have to figure out how to solve, right? How do you actually get people to trust each other on the blockchain? And how do you also make sure there's enough liquidity so as a buyer, I can find a seller counterpart or vice versa. And so not all of this is solved today. Again, this is going to be evolutionary process. But our approach to it is this. So the fundamental piece to develop trust is how do you actually do identity on the blockchain? And so we've been pioneering a lot of work as to how individuals on the blockchain with an Ethereum wallet can identify themselves as to who they are. And so there's a couple different projects that we're researching as well as pushing forward. One of them is ERC 725, which is an open standard for identity that Fabian came up with. Fabian being the creator of ERC 20, as well as the NIST browser. And then there's also a couple more experimental identity methods that we're experimenting with today to try to improve on that or try to make it cheaper and easier to bring your identity to the blockchain. But the core principle here is you should be able to add identity to your Ethereum wallet through your existing profile information, right? And so you should be able to authenticate your Facebook account, and Twitter account, your phone number, your email address, and say, hey, I actually own these accounts. And that should actually be associated with your Ethereum wallet. So then someone can say, oh, okay, this Ethereum wallet actually has these social profiles to it. But that's only step one, right? You can actually use the same framework to create attestations for other types of data. So potentially, my driver's license or my degree from college. These are all things that a third-party identity attestation provider can actually create attestations for to basically verify an Ethereum wallet on the blockchain, right? And so our goal is to number one, do some of that verification via Origin. So Origin can verify email address, phone number, et cetera, but also encourage other trusted third parties, whether that's a law school or whether that's government agency or whether that's a series of other well-known trusted applications today, also do those attestations, because that's what people can basically almost through like osmosis create that trust, create that identity from those existing services. And so that's a big component of what we're doing. And once you have identity, there are obviously other pieces as well. How do you actually start building reviews and reputation so that there's a history of successful transactions where there aren't disputes and things like that. And so we're doing some work there. And in the fail-safe, and we need fail-safes as well, right? So beyond that, how do you actually solve the dispute resolution and arbitration problem? Do you potentially have insurance? And so we have very early work in that area. So on the arbitration side, our marketplace smart contract that handles the transactions has basically an opening for an arbitrator to make a judgment, right? And so then if a buyer is buying something from the seller and their crypto, whether it's Ether, another ERC20 token, potentially a stable coin, is escrowed in the smart contract, an arbitrator can actually come in and resolve the dispute before that funding is released. And so we've already done some work there. There's also a lot of interesting ecosystem work that's still very, very early, but potentially we'll have some legs in the next couple of years around decentralized arbitration and decentralized insurance. Anyways, there are enough promising hypotheses that we believe we collectively, with the rest of the community, can actually solve this problem in the next, let's say, like 1 to 3 years, right? And if you can actually then solve the identity and associated trust issues on the blockchain, then the need for having that centralized player decreases dramatically.
Right, and that identity part of it is definitely a huge one. So are the transactions made with cryptocurrencies? Do you guys accept all ERC20s?
So right now on our DApp, it's just Ethereum during this beta period. But our smart contracts are flexible enough to support ERC20 tokens. Our current thinking is that one or more stablecoins are probably the best medium of exchange for applications. Consumers are not going to want to deal with hyper volatile cryptocurrencies. Like, what does it mean when you're paying for something and it's 5 ETH? 5 ETH could be worth $500 today at today's low Ethereum prices, but 2 weeks from now, maybe it's $1,000 for 5 ETH. So that's tricky, right? Either the buyer or seller is going to feel like they missed out. But if you have something that's actually $500 worth of a stable currency, a stable coin, let's say True USD or USDC, Gemini coin, wherever it might be, then it's much easier, I think, to get both sides to engage in that transaction. So that's not live today, but in Q1, we will definitely be putting forth some of our work with our support of stablecoins.
Great, and you guys are building on the Ethereum blockchain, which something I want to get to was the IPFS. So everybody knows Ethereum. We're not going to go over that, but IPFS is the interplanetary file system. It's something that's relatively new, something that people know that Filecoin are using. So can you tell us a little bit about how you guys are using or implementing IPFS?
Yeah, so IPFS has a couple pretty interesting properties that make it a very interesting technology to build on. The first of which is it's designed to be a distributed file storage system. So think of it as like a distributed Amazon S3, if you will. And so it's easy to actually store different types of data. In our case, we're storing JSON data that's then replicated across IPFS nodes and can be easily accessed. The other part of it that's really interesting is that it's what's known as content addressable. And so whatever content you put to IPFS, that content is hashed, and then there's like a hash that's returned to you. And so whenever you access that hash, you're guaranteed to get that same data, which means that that data can be trustworthy in a way that hash is similar to the mutable properties of the blockchain, right? You know that there's integrity that hasn't been messed with. And so these properties allow us to store a lot of metadata into IPFS. And Filecoin hasn't launched yet, and so today IPFS is largely a volunteer-driven network. There's a couple thousand nodes. We run some nodes as well, where that data can be hosted in a distributed way. So, for example, our data is being hosted by Protocol Labs, the parent company of IPFS, as an example. But what's really interesting about this is today it's quite cheap to store data on IPFS, whereas within Ethereum, it's expensive, it's computationally slow, and it's much more difficult to work with. And so a increasingly popular way to build decentralized infrastructure and applications is to store as much data as you can on IPFS, grab that content hash, and then store the hash value on the Ethereum blockchain. And this means that the Ethereum blockchain can be the smart contracts you have on the Ethereum blockchain could be lighter weight, store less data, but there's still a guarantee of data validity and integrity between the two systems. And that allows us to actually build much more complex applications where you can do a lot of the logic, let's say in JavaScript in your application, and a lot of your data is stored in IPFS. And then Ethereum really becomes the authoritative source for transactional data or very mission critical data, and really the way to map all the IPFS data with the rest of your application.
Great, that's very interesting work there, and IPFS itself is interesting as itself as a distributed file system. I think it was IPFS.io that was the. If you guys want to learn more about IPFS itself, so ending the podcast, I wanted to hear your opinion or your take on the future of the sharing economy. So we're now seeing marketplaces where people are individuals seeking different projects versus being an employee of a company. So where do you see the future of the sharing economy and the future of decentralized marketplaces?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll say is that the sharing economy is still rapidly expanding in size, right? So people, to a certain extent, think, oh, okay, cool, the sharing economy is mature. Like a lot of the feature set might be mature for an Airbnb or Uber, but in terms of market growth, it just continues to expand. And even beyond that, I was reading a pretty interesting article from folks and Andreessen Horowitz that was just published about like the various phases of marketplaces over the past 2 decades. And a couple interesting statistics there, something like 80% of the transaction value is still offline for marketplaces. So there are a lot of these like offline services marketplaces, like trillions of dollars of GMV, gross merchandise value, that is still happening in the offline world, right? And a lot of these are services. I think they said something like 80% of marketplaces are actually service marketplaces versus product marketplaces. Service marketplaces being someone is doing the service for someone else. A product marketplace, let's say, being like an Amazon or Shopify, for example. And all of that has yet to become digital and move online. So I think the market opportunity for connecting buyers and sellers online, forgetting about blockchain for a while, is enormous, right? It's got years and years of growth, magnitudes of financial value that is yet to be captured online. So that being said, I think a lot of these existing centralized players are going to continue to grow, but there still leaves plenty of opportunity for what we and other companies are trying to do with decentralized peer-to-peer networks. And so I think that on the decentralized side, we're going to naturally be slower to get that adoption, because we're starting 10 years after the traditional sharing economy, 20 years after the first traditional marketplaces like eBay or Craigslist. But I think we hopefully and other players will be able to start capturing some of that market share, right? As the entire market grows, we're going to be able to capture some of it. And I think we're going to start capturing share from the existing incumbents as well. I was having a conversation with Chris Dixon, again at Andreessen Horowitz, a while ago, and one of the pretty fascinating conversation topics we had was just around, in the beginning, it's really hard to build things in a decentralized way. So you have to replicate everything that already exists, right? So again, identity, reputation, trust. How do you get initial buyers and sellers and bootstrap the network and get folks to actually use what we're all working together on? However, at some point, you're going to hit an inflection point, right? When you're building open source protocols, and especially open source protocols that have these crypto economic incentives that incentivize developers to build on you, that incentivize marketplace operators to build on you, that incentivize individual buyers and sellers to transact on your platform, at some point that inflection point will hit. And now there's actual reason for more and more people to get behind your mission and to push the platform forward, right? To advance the protocols, to increase adoption, to build new applications, to collaborate together, because these open source platforms with incentives ultimately are going to be more attractive for developers and marketplace operators and entrepreneurs versus these closed platforms. Closed platforms, we've seen examples where Twitter has cracked down on its developer community, where Facebook has basically created Zynga and then took down Zynga based on its governance of its own private closed platform. And so we have a big bet that having these open platforms with crypto economic incentives will really propel peer-to-peer commerce, these decentralized marketplaces. Maybe it'll take a year or 2 years or 3 years, but certainly 5 or 10 years down the line, I think it's going to be a very, very significant part of the entire marketplace GMV that's created. Yeah,
great. It's crazy to think that 80% of marketplaces are offline, and to me, something small like the OfferUp application brings a small amount of people sort of online. But like you said, once you reach that inflection point, once it's made easier for offline businesses to come online, there's enormous potential. So where can the viewers learn more about Origin Protocol?
Yeah, so there are a couple of resources. I would say the first thing to do, again, is check out our decentralized application. It's dap.originprotocol.com. We'd love to get some feedback. It's still early, but you can buy, you can sell, you can message other users in a totally decentralized way. If you're looking for more general information about the company, just take the DApp out of it, go to our company website, originprotocol.com. Now, if you're even more interested, and we would love to have you be more deeply embedded in our community, I'd invite you to check out our GitHub if you're a developer, github.com/originprotocol, and also join our Discord channel. So Discord is where we actually do all our work. That's where the engineers hang out, the designers hang out, our marketing team, our community team, and it's all open to the public. We have the majority of our conversations and discussions as open as possible, and we publish most of our meeting notes to publicly viewable Google Docs as well. So you can join our Discord channel, originprotocol.com/Discord. We'll then reroute you to Discord, and then you can join that channel. Once you do, feel free to hit me up personally, right? So the founders, the early employees, as well as extended community members are all available to engage in discussion. So really want to just reiterate to everyone that we want to hear from the community. The community is what's going to really project or push our project forward. And this is a collective mission and vision that we're after, right? Origin, the company, is playing its part to kind of create the initial version of the platform, but we really see it as a global effort, a community-driven effort, where hopefully a couple of years from now, there's thousands of people contributing to our code base, and thousands of developers building applications on top of us, and millions of buyers and sellers that are engaging on the platform.
Great. And for the viewers, you can go ahead and check out those links down in the description below. For those of you watching live, thank you for joining us today. And yeah, we'll see. Be sure to subscribe to OC Live. We host weekly guests to discuss the latest in blockchain. And yeah, thank you all of you for watching. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you. Have a good one.